She is many things rolled into one very formidable package. Yesterday we had a wonderfully invigorating session. It was a great start to the festival here at the Pune University, and the debates and presentations were diverse and complex and extremely interesting, ranging from Manipur and Assam to Kashmir, Maharashtra and Chhattisgarh. We covered a lot of ground, a lot of land geographically as well as looking at issues. Once again, I'd like to thank Anaga and Swati and the team at the Women's Studies Center for all the help and support. Once again, we want to dedicate this morning to the memory of Sharmila Rege and Viram Sharmila of Manipur. Without going any further, hand you over to Urvashi.
Thank you, Preeti. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I think I have a new name now, Formidable Package. It's wonderful to be here, but it's also quite difficult for those of us who have interacted with the Women's Studies Department and with Sharmila Rege over the years and have admired her and read her writings and been strongly and deeply influenced by her. It's very difficult to be in this university, in this space, and not have Sharmila here. I'd really like to remember her extremely vibrant and generous presence and the ways in which Sharmila and her colleagues actually built the wonderful Women's Studies Department here at Pune University. This morning's panel is focusing on new feminisms and women's movements. We're going to come at this subject in a fairly broad way because we have a really rich panel here of both writers and activists from the different northeastern states and also outside. We're going to split the panel into two. In the morning, focusing, well, it's all in the morning, but pre-coffee basically, focusing more on women's writing, and then coming to activist interventions in the post-coffee session. In many ways, the northeastern states have produced a wonderful crop of writers, creative writers, fiction writers, non-fiction writers, and women have been particularly strong among these. And there has been willy-nilly a kind of connection between women's writing and women's activism in many of the northeastern states, especially because with many places being caught in different kinds of conflict, the situations of conflict find their way into so much creative writing that takes place. Even though sometimes authors might define themselves not as activists or not being involved in politics on the ground, but the realities, as happens in Kashmir, as happens in Sri Lanka and other places caught in conflict, do find their way into the writing and form a major preoccupation in the writing. Similarly, the work of many writers has been inspirational and has been used quite a lot by activists who have been involved in women's groups and women's movements on the ground in the Northeast, and has also been studied in university courses where women's studies courses are being set up, or indeed in straightforward literature courses. So, for example, the work of Temsula Au, the work of Easterine Kir, these are prescribed textbooks in the Northeast, and both writers deal a lot with issues that have grown out of the conflict there. So in a sense, there is a strong connection between these two seemingly different and seemingly opposed ends of women's involvement. And we are going to explore some of these connections today after hearing from the writers. And I'm going to start, let me just introduce the panel to you first. Avinu Kir on my extreme right, who you met yesterday, those of you who were here, you heard from her. She has very gracefully stepped in to replace Rosemary, who could not make it. Abhinav is from Nagaland. She's a civil servant and a writer. And as she spoke yesterday, her writing is not consciously informed by any political stances or any grassroots activism on the ground. She writes because she loves to write. She's a creative writer. It's creativity that is most important to her. But nonetheless, several of the themes seep their way into her writing, and we're going to start the panel by having Abhinav talk briefly about one story of hers and read an excerpt from it. And the story has to do with the rape of a woman. I will leave her to tell you a little about it and read from it. Next to her is Balinder Dhanua, who lives in Delhi, who is an artist, painter and a writer, and who has an Assamese mother and a Punjabi father, and has grown up all her life in the Northeast with a sense of being an outsider, in what is called mainland India, but particularly in Delhi with the sense of being an outsider, quite a misfit, labeled chinky because of the way she looks, but who has actually seen this not as a disadvantage but as a strength. For Balinder, the space where she is a margin of a minority is a very important space to inhabit. It influences the language she uses, it influences the subjects she chooses, it influences how she sees herself, and she sees this mixture not as something that places her outside different spaces, but as something that helps her to create her own unique space, which is neither periphery nor margin nor center stage. And in creating that space, Balinder sees herself as actually subverting this whole thing of slotting people into categories of authenticity, wholeness, etc. And she will talk more about that in relation to her writing. She has recently published a novel called Echoes in the Well, which is available outside should any of you wish to buy it. Next to Balinder is Jarjum Ete, who needs really no introduction to, especially to Pune Women Studies people. Jarjum is from Arunachal. She is a strong activist who has been involved in the setting up of the in the Arunachal Commission of Women. She has also been involved in working on the ground and implementing panchayats in Arunachal, in looking at issues of customary law. And she has also worked with children quite a lot. Jarjum talks of getting involved, not coming to her political involvement as a feminist, but basically being forced to act when she saw injustice around her, and when she became aware of growing up in a society where women are so discriminated against that even inside the halls of parliament, politicians are able to make anti-women statements and to say that beating women or beating their wives is normal and natural and they can get away with that. So that was one of the first things that propelled her into the kind of activism that she has been involved in. Another remarkable thing about Jarjum's work is that she has been extremely outspoken on the issue of violence against women, but not only state violence, not only the violence of state actors such as the police and the army, but she has been outspoken about violence from within communities and violence of non-state actors, especially militant violence. and it's very, very difficult to raise your voice on all these counts, but she has done that consistently, and she's going to speak about her work in Arunachal and the connections with the outside world on this. Roshmi Goswami here is an old friend. I was trying to figure out how to say that. We have long been involved in the women's movement and have fought side by side on very many campaigns. In a long essay that Roshmi wrote for a book on women's activism and women's movements in India, she talked of the Beijing Women's Conference of 1995 being a turning point in her life and in some ways propelling her into the activism on and about women that she has subsequently been deeply involved in. She comes from Assam. She cut her political teeth in the Assam agitation. She had a strong involvement in it and strong family involvement in it because one of the key people, Bridget Hukan, is her husband's brother, her brother-in-law. And Roshmi's mission really has been to take the concerns and voices of the Northeast into both national and international forums. She has also taught, but teaching wasn't really her thing, but being involved in local politics was very much so. She became part of the Northeast Network, which is a group that is very well known in the Northeast and which has picked up on the tradition of activism in the Northeast and built on it. And she was one of the architects of the very first comprehensive solid report on conflict and its impact on women in the Northeast. She has also worked with the Ford Foundation and with UN Women and has now abandoned all of that to go back to the Northeast and lead a life she thought of luxury, but it ends up not being that. She thought of retirement, but it ends up not being that. I think she's busier than ever, working on many of the same things. One of the things that Roshmi describes very beautifully in this piece she wrote, and I hope that you'll talk a little about that, Roshmi, is that she's also been quite involved with the Mira Paibis in Manipur. And one of those women, strong, solid, dynamic, articulate inside Manipur, when placed in the context of the Beijing meeting where thousands and thousands of women from across the world were, suddenly became very different and shrank into herself and saw herself or felt quite out of place. And Roshmi raises this issue of what it means to be part of a community and the strength that it gives you, and what it means to be alone out there in the world, even if that world is actually broadly speaking a sympathetic and feminist world. So I hope that you will address that somewhere in what you're going to say. And finally, Madhu Gurum, who is a writer, half Nepali, half Gurkha, and who has written short stories and who comes from another end of the scale in Madhu's life as an army wife, army daughter. One of the two key points have been two wars. The 1962 war with China and the 1971 war of which India was an active part. And she has seen and written about and been influenced by the many stories of both grief and dislocation and displacement of women during that war. And these she talks about in a very, very moving fashion, and I hope that you will talk about that a little bit to do with your work. And also, you know, Madhu's been feeling quite disturbed listening to all the army bashing that has gone on yesterday, which in human rights cases becomes part of the discourse. and would like to talk a little bit about what it means to be living inside that system, which is a unique perspective which I think would be really worth listening to. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to first Avinu, who will tell you about her story and read.
I'm going to do a reading of my short story titled Letting Go. This is a story of a bride-to-be coming to terms with her history of rape. I was moved to write this story after reading a news article in our local newspaper about a father who forgave his young daughter's rapist right after the incident. And I tried to imagine how this would affect the little girl years later. As you know, Nagaland is a patriarchal society, and this incident made me question a lot about who has the right to forgive a crime against another human being. And in this incident, I felt that women were seen as women first and then humans. And it also showed that in this context, that in Nagaland, a daughter is seen as a father having the right to forgive his daughter's rapist. It reveals that women are seen as property. A daughter is a father's property, and then later she gets married and she's her husband's property. And I'm a Christian. My faith is very important to me, and like all religions, forgiveness. I believe in forgiveness, but such flippant forgiveness, it diminishes the severity of the terrible crime of rape. And so I was moved to write this story. I'll just read extracts of it. This is when the protagonist, the young girl, she's getting ready for her wedding day. She's packing her belongings to move into her husband's house. She was getting married soon. Sorting out her meager belongings was the first phase of preparation for the new life she would soon embark. He had proposed a few nights ago, and she had shyly accepted, like they both knew she would. She was 28 and still retained youth's fresh-faced sweetness. Him, on the other hand, was an unattractive man, already well into his mid-40s. But she had no complaints. If anything, she was grateful that he had asked her at all. She had long resigned herself to the likely possibility that marital life was not to be part of her destiny. So therefore, it did not matter to her that he was unemployed or that he could seldom hold his liquor. He had asked her to be his, and that excused all his weaknesses. A feeling of affection overcame her as she recalled his uncharacteristic solemnity while discussing plans for the inn.
Thank you so much, Avinu. That's really beautiful reading, and the story is completely beautiful and really moving and very complex, as you can see even from this short extract. For those of you who want to read the full story, it will be published in Avinu's collection of stories, which will come out in, I think, in a few months from now, but it will also appear in Caravan next month, in the month of March, as the full story. I would urge you to really read it. It tackles so many issues, about the whole question of forgiveness, the burden on the woman, that she has to carry the burden of this, and the question of whether speaking out or staying silent, which is something that has been endlessly debated in among women's groups. We'll move to Belinda. Would you like to tell us a little bit about your writing and some of the issues that preoccupy you, outsider, insider, identity, and whatever else?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to start with a question. It is a rhetorical question, so I'm not expecting any of you to answer right away. But the question is, what language are you? This was a question I was first asked when I was a young girl many years ago. It was a question I didn't understand then, and which I've subsequently used to underscore the impossibility of fixing one's identity. I have kept this question in mind through the years to use as a starting point to think about the human need to recognize and define others, to categorize and to fix, to draw in and to push out. I recognize this question as the gatekeeper that allows some in and keeps others out. And I recognize that this question has an elasticity whose measure I do not have. We see, for instance, ethnicity, caste, class, or gender as categorizing the margins. What of disability? What of mental illness? Do you speak the language of madness? This is not an effort to identify yet another group on the margins. Rather, it is an effort to recognize lives that have been traumatized from living in the longest state-community conflict zone in South Asia. This is a recognition of the mental health issues that arise from such situations, some of which have been studied and documented in Bearing Witness, a report on the impact of violence on women in Nagaland and Assam. There are copies of this outside. But let me start again, in the beginning, with the particular. Yesterday, while in one of the sessions, Mitra mentioned that for all good writers, you start with the particular and you hope that it becomes the universal. So I'm going to take her as my cue here and say, I will start with the particular and move on to the general. I am talking about fractured, shifting identities today in the context of writing, particularly fiction writing, and even more particularly women writing fiction. I'll take the easy path and start with myself. I was born in Shillong to an Assamese woman and Punjabi man. Their names were strange to the people of Shillong as mine was to be, Bilinder Dhanawa. In the Roman Catholic school I attended from the age of 3, the nuns called me Belinda Singh. Nobody objected to this, allowing too generously perhaps for the inability of Irish tongues to wrap themselves around native names. I was Belinda Singh until it was time for me to graduate from school, at which time I insisted on having Belinda Dhanawa inscribed on my school leaving certificate. On the streets of Shillong, it didn't matter what my name was. I was the cur, outsider. I suffered some insult, but no injury from this status. I was one of the lucky ones. When I tell my story, I can say I left Shillong of my own free will. I was not forced to leave for fear of my life. Shillong taught me in the early years of my life what it is to be outsider, a lesson that was reinforced on the streets of Delhi, where I became chinky. I saw then that I had not been chinky enough for the Northeast and was too chinky for the North. And now, returning to India after 20 years of being away, an old story re-emerges, and my North Indian friends unexpectedly struggle with my name. Belinda? No, I answer. Belinda. Can I be a language I do not speak? I am the language I do not speak. I am all the languages I do not speak. When my Northeastern identity comes into play, I am immediately pointed to my self-perception as a woman. And as immediately, I realize that this perception is colored by the fictions from the inside and from the outside. Strong, independent, liberated, modern are just so many of the words that have been used to describe us, often with admiration, but as often to judge. It might suggest from the positive stereotypes inherent in these descriptions and definitions that this is one fiction we would like to live in, and it is certainly a fiction that we often embrace as we attempt to understand, to cope, to make life endurable. It is a fiction that does not allow us to admit to weakness, does not allow us to acknowledge the inability to cope. I have not lived in my hometown of Shillong nor anywhere else in the Northeast for many years now, and I depend on the spoken and written word stories to inform me. Often, as might seem inevitable, conflict forms the basis of these stories, but the texture of each story differs with each storyteller. In this room, I do not claim an ethnicity as part of my identity. I recognize multiplicity and ambivalence. I celebrate in all its versions an elusive ethnicity split into local, aberrant particularities. In this room of my own making, there is no outsider, just as there is no insider. In this room, hybridity is celebrated in all its messiness, and there is no effort made to identify how my body relates to geographic space, nor my disposition to cultural constraints. But when sometimes I am asked to acknowledge that one aspect of my ethnicity dominates my good behavior or taste, I know again the limits of my autonomy. As a writer, this awareness is constantly in my mind. What language am I? In this room of my own making, I recognize the constructedness and potential multiplicity of all ethnic identities. I know that standing in the margins, I will always be at odds with the legitimate, as I transform, mutate, metamorphose. And I recognize too that my desire for an improvised identity is not a matter of free choice. I can claim, I can say, I am this, I am this, I am this. But you will make of me what you want, and you will ask, what language are you? I could not then as a child, but I do question today why the biological, literal, and real is given precedence over the mythical, figural, and fictional. Am I not transformed each time I tell my story, propelled into a future of my own making? I do not search memory to discover myself, nor to look for histories that delineate ancestry. I am produced every day in the worlds that I speak, made visible in my silence, defined and defined by my hybridity, not unique nor familiar, but always spontaneous and fashioned by process. I live in this fictional place and dimension, a place that those who live in negatives create to find a positive. Can I be a language I do not speak?
I'm going to straight away ask the two speakers now, first Jarjam and then Roshni, to talk about their work and to talk about new feminisms and new issues to do with women in the Northeast. So Jarjam, over to you.
After the very moving first session of the day, this session perhaps will be more like the bone part of it. The flesh and blood has already been taken by the bones. Oh, we are the bones. And it was bone. Yeah. You can interpret it in any ways you want.
Roshni says you're the
backbone or bone of contentions that we deal with. In fact, the topic of the session is new feminism and women's movement. And last night, when we heard the Tetsio sisters sing with so much of grace and perform so well, entertain us with so much of power, back into their performance, the songs. It was not just a delight to watch them, but their narrations. Everything boils down to the fact that Roshni ended up saying, these are the new feminists. And talking of feminism, when I started off as a young volunteer immediately after my college to work with an organization called the Arunachal Pradesh Women's Welfare Society, I never thought the kind of work we are going to do had a name like feminism. I had graduated, no doubt, but again, having graduated from a night college in the hinterland, the remotest of northeastern states called Arunachal Pradesh, going through the day-to-day college syllabus, even as a young mother, running through the classes, kind of trying to juggle with a little baby and a little job, things like that. Now people say, oh, you're so energetic, you are so empowered, you could do things, you could go to college after marriage, you continued that. So those days when I used to wear dresses, go out in my skirts and pants even after marriage to college. Lots of elder women used to say, you don't wear them after marriage. I said, but this is comfortable. I can at least, go on my scooter, and it's in terms of mobility, in terms of walking, things like that. It's much more free than the wraparound we wear. Then, I realized I was getting branded as a firebrand. So I thought my mother was the most powerful woman till then, because she had married, despite my maternal uncles and family saying no to my father's, marriage with my father, but she married for love, and I always thought, my mother is a very powerful woman. And when my father was in the outposts, in a remote place, he went to the remoter places, and he got back to town only when I got married. And I had never seen my father home for more than a month. And as a little kid, still in school, a month was just a few evenings for us with him. The role of a woman, how a mother can mold the psyche or the sense of independence or sense of worth in the children. So I always regarded my mother as a very strong woman, a strong and one. Ever since I got oriented about feminism and the feminist movement and women's empowerment, I thought she was one hell of a feminist. But then I have also two daughters of my own. I got married off early because there was a trend. So these girls had the liberty to choose their spouses. They had the liberty to choose how long they want to study. One is pursuing PhD in the University of Bonn on development. She was trained as an architect from School of Planning and Architecture. Now she chose to get into development sector, and now she's doing her PhD on dams in Arunachal Pradesh. Now that is one big concern for a state like Arunachal, big dams, mega dams. And people think I have influenced her, but she's again a girl of a very independent mindset, and she says, "You, that firebrand woman, come on, you are not good enough." That's the definition the younger generation has of us. Now, when we're talking about new families, I am trying to posit myself. Where am I? Belinda talked about what language am I. Now I'm trying to figure out who am I in this whole movement. Am I a bridge? Am I the link? Am I just a voice? Am I medium? So, looking at those, and every time, in 2012 when we had this huge exodus from Pune and Bangalore and Hyderabad of Northeast children, we're trying to figure out all the efforts we make to relate to the country. Our children who are outside the region, they still face these kind of identity crisis as Indians. And listening to Belinda actually moved me so much, because we can empathize. Our own children, when they go out of the region, they feel the same thing. And again, back home, we tell our children, they are very kind of angry and agitated that fellow Indians don't take us as Indians. So why should we actually go with China? And we tell them, do you actually treat other Indians as fellow Indians when they come to the Northeast? And for us, every South Indian is a Madrasi. For us, every North Indian is a Bihari. So these kind of things, actually, the whole identity crisis is nothing strange in a big country like India. And I think perhaps we need to look at those, and there have been lots of demands from the Northeast for inclusion of the history of Northeast or about the culture of Northeast in school syllabi, the CBSE or even the state boards of different states. That is one. Of course, the other one I touched upon was about how it's necessary for perhaps the new feminists and neo-feminism to kind of talk about, focus or highlight about how to get women into the political processes of decision making, not just as voters. As of records, perhaps the Central Election Commission of India or the researchers in political sciences, they would say women are the largest voters in India, but we need to see them as the decision makers of the country. And our friend here, the gentleman, talked about the possibility of the passage of women's resolution bill in the next couple of months, maybe during the budget session. But the big question mark at the back of our mind would be, would the right-thinking women actually get into the assemblies and the parliament? Are they good enough as women leaders to represent our concerns as feminists, or the voices from the women's movement or the human rights movement or the people's movement? Will they actually make the difference? So perhaps the younger generation need to think about how best we can play our roles as mothers, as educators, as siblings, as relations, or as fellow students or academicians. But we need to get lots of sensitive people, not just women, but male women families also into the processes. People say, you had so much role to play. We brought in the Women's Commission after lots of struggle. We got the 73rd Amendment provisions for reservation of women in panchayats after more than a decade of struggle. Because the whole traditional patriarchal mindset and leadership said if the women got into leadership, who would be cooking, who would be looking after the children, who would be working in the fields and things like that. So today it's a job back home when we ask the men, do your wives still cook food for you, or they feed you raw rice? And things are changing. Things are changing, and that's the most satisfying, feeling when you look around and hear about and read about women panchayat leaders, more than 3,000 of them in the 3 tiers of Arunachal panchayats, and we are into the 3rd generation of leadership. But unfortunately, when we were campaigning for implementation of the reservation, they used to also joke, is Jati planning to contest for a Gram Panchayat, seat or something like that. And then the pressure also started coming on me. Good husbands or good mothers or good brothers, they started coming back to me and saying, you are encouraging everyone to contest elections, but what about you? And at the national level, people like Medha Patkar, they were saying activists must not join politics. So we're in a dilemma if to join politics or not. But finally, when I was also president of the movement, the women's organization, I got this invitation from the chief minister, who was also the party president of the Congress, saying, the Congress party is looking for good women leaders. Why don't you join us? So I said, okay, let me think about it. I discussed with my friends and I said, from the people's movement, from the women's movement, we keep raising issues. We do discuss and deliberate. We take topics to the people. There are lots of debates about it. But then we are not there where the final decision making is taking place. We are not in the assemblies. We are nowhere. So I said, I'll continue to be in the movement if the women's organization or the men, my friends in the movement accept me as continuing with the women's rights movement. But I have been invited and I want to explore this opportunity. And 10 years down the line, my presence in the party has hardly been acknowledged, except by the All India Congress Committee, which started Panchayat Sangathan, and they say, Jaju, in Arunachal, we need your leadership, we need your vision and participation in training the Congress Panchayat leaders, both men and women. They made me the chairperson. Unfortunately, come election, the women are so divided politically because someone's husband is in Congress, someone's husband is brother is in the BJP, or someone's husband is leading the regional party. And I realized, every election breaks down the movement into fragments, and it takes time to regroup. And every time there is a communal clash between some of the tribes, then the movement is broken. So there has been this painful, heartbreaking experiences time and again. Maybe because we are a small population and most of our representatives or the leaders in the women's movement come from different groups and different political backgrounds. So the simple existence of a women's study center doesn't ensure good performance through the department or through the center. And very interestingly, the university never had a sexual harassment complaint committee in the first place. So a couple of years back, when the Vice Chancellor was accused of harassing a woman lady faculty from one of the departments, the university couldn't handle it. So much so that later on there was many other issues, complaints against the Vice Chancellor, and he was forced to leave. And new people have come one after another, but the situation hasn't looked up because recently one of the senior most professors was alleged of molesting a scholar. And when I wanted to come down to the university, they said, please don't come because things are likely to be communalized. That's because I also happen to be a former leader of my own community, from which the student victim belongs to. They say, Judge, because I have been a CBO leader and the victim happens to be from my community, the university thinking people, heads, the intellectuals, the elites, they are saying, please don't come because it's likely to be communalized. So those are the situations where I would have liked to see the lady faculty members or the staffers or the students to unite and say, the professor who has molested has to be taken to task, but it didn't happen. Today they are saying some of the women faculty members are actually supporting the accused professor because he was their supervisor or he was their teacher. So those kind of energy in terms of setting the rule effectively is not happening in Arunachal. That's been my experience. And I thought Avino might say it, but since Rosemary is not here, on behalf of Nagaland, I just want to share their efforts. Nagaland as a state, the village councils and all, they have the Naga hobos of different communities and all. But in the urban domain, especially in Dimapur, they have the municipal elections, the civic body elections under the 74th Amendment Act. And the women of Nagaland are very empowered economically, politically. They are thinkers, they are very assertive, they are highly educated, qualified women. And because of the, educational exercises or works that churches have been doing, and as one of the oldest states which have been with the church, quality of education is pretty good. And the women of Nagaland, they have been wanting to see the implementation of the reservation of seats, wanted seats for women in the municipal corporation elections of Dimapur. But now, interestingly, cutting across all political parties, cutting across all the tribal ho-hos, they have taken position in the assembly and in the tribal ho-hos that they will not allow reservation of seats for women even in the municipal elections, and the Naga Mothers Association, under the banner of Naga Mothers Association, the women of Nagaland collectively has approached the Supreme Court for the court's intervention. And perhaps these are studies, I'm sure Naga students might be doing it already, the young women, but from different states, if scholars start coming in interacting, because my own personal interaction was in Jharkhand, in Manipur, in Nagaland, when we were lobbying for establishment of Women Commission. The women from these states were working, but their leadership were not listening to them. But an unidentified face from another state coming to meet the chief ministers, the governors, interacting with the media, the human rights activists, and appealing to them to kind of lobby for the establishment of Women Commission. It did work. So I believe in the fact that we tend to listen to outsiders better. They are critic in writings, in media, in perhaps analyses, in reports. If there are critical kind of inputs from the feminist movement, from the feminist scholars and researchers, I feel Northeast actually can benefit a lot. And similar can be our sharing of understandings of how women are treated across the country in different communities, in different states. Thank you so much for your questions.
Women's groups have been very much at the heart of working with women in elected posts for leadership, and the whole question of women entering politics to build up a critical mass has been very much at the center of discussions inside the feminist movement. And what you were saying about the difficulties of operating in that system, where pressures from the family, pressures from outside, political pressure and so on, and the need to take account of them. I was reminded of a conversation that I was having a few days ago in Hyderabad with two women. One is P. Shivakami, a Dalit leader from Tamil Nadu who started her own political party, and the other is Salma, a writer and Shivakami is also a writer. Salma, who came into state level politics through the Panchayat on reserve seats and is currently out of power but applying for a ticket to stand for the Lok Sabha elections. And both of them were talking about very similar things that you're saying. About how the sort of pressures that come on women, so that the new feminisms which have in some way pushed women into this area are very embattled with all kinds of pressures that come on women from other places. I think also, thank you also for pointing out the Nagaland issue and speaking of academia and underscoring the importance of outside support, especially on issues to do with the women's movement, where this support has crossed borders quite a lot. I think that's really important that you pointed that out, and I'm sure Roshni will pick up on those issues. So Roshni, let's turn to your presentation now.
Everybody once again. I'll start with just touching on what level of activism was there even before we came onto the scene in Northeast India, but not in all the states, in one or two. The roles that we have played, my organization and others, and where are we today? This is what. The Northeast is actually quite known for women's activism, and it's known primarily, I think, because of Manipur. And I want to acknowledge and I want to salute, starting with Iram Sharmila, the kind of activism which has been there. For me, it has empowered me each time I have traveled to Manipur. So activism, women's activism in Manipur started maybe even before that, but as far as we know, in 1904, where they had the first Nupi Lan on women's war. And this was against regressive imposition of a British regressive policy on them. This was followed by another one in the 1930s, maybe 1930, 34, and subsequently in the 1970s, where women mobilized against alcoholism and the violence which was associated with that. So Manipur has been in the forefront on activism. One of the reasons is that Manipur society, I don't know, I mean there are different reasons for it, but there are some very positive ones. One is the extreme kind of very, very vibrant social interaction and social mobilization, and the hub of that interaction and social mobilization is the marketplace. The e-marketel, which is, just many of you who have read something, of course, know about it. It used to be the market run solely by women, for women, by women, and so on. And it is a hub, it is not just a market hub, it is a hub where women actually dress up to go and sit at that market stall that they have, all kinds. There is also no hierarchy of class, because royalty that I interviewed also had her stall there, including alongside a kind of daily vegetable vendor. So it is a space for mobilizing, and women would take that space very seriously, dress up, be there, and there would be interaction. And these stalls have been passed down from generations, from mother to daughter, mother-in-law to daughter, and it is really a hub of extreme social mobilization. So that has been one of the reasons. The other one, I think, Manipur society is also very interestingly, and we can draw parallels with the Indian system of Grihasti, Brahmachari, and so on. They also divide a woman's roles into different phases. And people like us, except Afina, of course, 40 plus is what is called Hanubi, where you are kicked out of the house, of the domesticity, and you are supposed to be out taking on social causes and social issues. So these were some of the factors which has enabled a level of activism which we don't find elsewhere. Including, we have found that there are women's credit groups called Marups, savings. So there is already women are working together in groups. This is also evident in Nagaland, where there are solidarity groups. Yesterday's performance with that, so you saw the community, how the community comes together to work. So these are all spaces, informal mobilizing of women, and while women are pounding rice, they are also exchanging, the problems. A lot of the songs yesterday really resonated with the kind of work we do, because of the kind of issues that those songs, in a kind of playful manner, but they are women's issues which are being raised. So similarly, you have such solidarity groups, informal organizing in Assam. So all of this has been pretty strong across the region, and I think that is also right in Mizoram. I'm not very sure, Margaret can correct me. So this is the kind of space that we actually came in when we decided to mobilize in the Northeast, and what provided us the opportunity or the feeling for mobilizing was the Beijing conference. What is unprecedented about the Beijing conference was that a very conscious decision was taken that there would be an attempt to bring in voices from the margins, and whether it is fish workers union, Dalit women's voices, tribal women's voices, indigenous, Northeast, and so on. This was like at the national level, right, Urvashi? So this was very, very critical about the Beijing conference, and we got into the fray. To begin with, I wasn't a feminist. I was very stuck with the identity politics of the region, and very closely linked with the Naga Students Union and the Assam agitation and movement. So, and working with craftspeople, they happened to be women, but I was not necessarily a feminist thinker. But the whole question of why must the Northeast voice be left out of such a massive national mobilization is what propelled me to get into that process. And we kind of mobilized across the whole regions of the Northeast, traveling extensively, holding different kinds of meetings all over. It was also at that moment of time the height of the Naga-Kuki conflict, very, very intense, brutal conflict. And I remember traveling from village to village, and there is great generosity in the Northeast. Wherever you go, you get a gift. So I would get a Kuki shawl in one village, and I would be traveling to a Naga village, the next one, so I was traveling in a jeep, so I would roll up the shawl and hide it in case they think I've come, so it was actually that level of animosity at that moment of time. But we mobilized because we wanted women's voices really to reach a national, international forum, and not just us sitting in Guwahati or Delhi and saying, or sitting in the university and documenting these other issues. We wanted those real voices to be heard and reflected, so that was the process. In that process, and then finally we went to Beijing with a very large delegation from the Northeast, and what Urvashi mentioned in the morning, there were very important lessons that one drew from that participation. One is that we took women out of their context, we broke, there were women who, especially the Myra Paibis, worked in groups, and given policies, we can only support one person from one organization, so we lifted one person out and took the person to Beijing because we wanted to show that we have all these grassroots women with us, and it was, I went through very many moments of guilt and deep understanding of what you do when you work with grassroots women. What is their reality? What is it that you're trying to impose? What is it that you are trying to project? So I cannot go into that because of lack of time. That was an important issue. The other important issue was there a Northeast solidarity? I mean, when we mobilized, there was. When we reached Beijing, I don't know. A lot of things happened in Beijing, and one of the things was that there was another forum, another person, because of the ethnic conflict which was there, and she was not from the region but very connected to the region and was supporting one ethnic group. So it was important for her to portray the problems of that group. And we were very clear in our vision that we are talking about violations by all sides. We are talking about women being caught in the middle of different sets of guns, whether it was the Naga gun, whether it was the army, whether whoever it was, whether it was the Assam police or whether it was Ulfa. We are going to address that. And so our position was very vulnerable because you were questioned by all sides. There are many stories connected with our vulnerability, and so there were such moments where you kind of understood the kind of, the layers and layers upon which we had to uncover to build a Northeast solidarity of the ethnic kind of loyalties, where would we be able to build such a movement. So anyway, with some of those lessons we came back, but our main focus was to shift the thinking from needs to rights, whatever that is, that the Northeast there are many vulnerabilities, there has been many violations and so on, but there is also tremendous strength in the region, and we need to build on that, bring in a perspective which was not just depending on welfare and that we are victims and the state sends us doles and that makes us even worse. So we started that process of shifting the understanding from needs to rights and trying to reach out to bring in more voices. One, there are many things that we did, but one very, very important conference, because people suddenly mentioned it to me a couple of weeks back, and therefore I want to talk. We did a huge Northeast Peasant Women's Conference where we brought in grassroots voices, and we had 9 or 10 simultaneous translations going on while that conference was. So it was a very, very vibrant with real voices. During the Beijing process also, we went to women's studies centers and we went to the academia, but somehow there was a lacuna in what was the material which was present about women's realities in Northeast India versus what was on the ground. So wherever we organized interactions, we made sure that we brought women from the marketplace. We brought vendors and peasant women and the Myra Paibis and so on to interact with university, academia and others. There should be this vibrant interaction and not those poor women are in sheds which are leaking, and you had those kind of accounts of what the Imakiter was all about. So we needed to vitalize also others into thinking that the grassroots women bring a different kind of reality and a different kind of strength, and that needs to get in to building a Northeast women's movement. And a very, very important exchange which Urvashi had organized with Kashmir women and Northeast women.
Seva.
And Seva, sorry. And there the Kashmiri women understood, I mean, they talked about that in the Northeast there was already this level of activism which could be used to one's advantage in doing peace building and conflict transformation. So this was a very important exchange that we did. The other thing is, because of the nature of our work and the focus, our linkages were made more at the South Asian level and more primarily with Colombo, with Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka was also going through a process of conflict, very violent conflict, and a very, very sophisticated feminist analysis of where women were placed in that conflict. So our linkage became more South Asian rather than more national, and also because of our human rights work we linked to groups in rest of Asia and so on. So this was the solidarity. But today we are linked to groups working on peace across borders in the South Asia context, and for us that is very important. I mean, because they bring in an analysis, and I mentioned a little yesterday about our concern of the whole economics of protracted conflict. It is something that we cannot in the Northeast sit in isolation and address. It is something which is happening across borders. It is connected to what is happening in Bangladesh. It is connected to the whole question of the arms race. It is connected to the whole issue of drug trade and so on. So there are, in conflict transformation, there are huge issues and women's kind of interests at stake. And for this we need greater solidarity and support from across the border. And I think that is where we are today. Oh, one last note on peace. I just want to add, I mean, especially what Aquino had said, this whole thing of when you talk about peace building in the Northeast, you're always talking about forgiveness. Let us forgive and let us forgive our violators and perpetrators, and that is the concept, the government-state concept of peace building. I think for me, peace building is an extremely political agenda. It is not apolitical, and we need to remember that. And that real peace can only come if there has been justice. There cannot be peace where there is impunity. I mean, you may choose to forget, but there has to be an acknowledgement of violations. There has to be redress for those violations in whatever way, but it cannot be swept under the carpet and said nothing happened in the past, now we do peace building. It cannot. If you want real and sustained peace, it has to be built along those lines. So when people talk about a peace building somewhere, I always question, what is the approach to your making peace? Who has to give, who has to take?
Thank you very much, Roshmi, Jarjum, for bringing in both your perspectives, for locating the discussions firmly within the politics of the local, the national, the regional and the international, and connecting what's happening with women to all the major issues, particularly the question of politics and political participation, religion and economics. I think those are three really broad economic questions. I just briefly want to link what Roshmi and Jarjum have been saying to the discussion of the morning. And it seems to me that there are some commonalities and specificities that are important to note. One key thing which is common across the board, whether you are functioning in the Northeast, in the different states of the Northeast, or whether you are elsewhere, is the whole issue of violence against women. And both at an individual level, at a family level, at a community level, at the level of the state, at the level of non-state actors, and so on, because non-state actors also within quote civilian life are very much there. The question of human rights and the solidarity that is built around human rights and the alliances that are built across borders of all kinds, not only administrative borders but also different groups allying in the battle for human rights. And then the specificities, I think, which come out in each of the presentations, and if you look at them as a whole, the fact of the Northeast, many of the states of the Northeast being caught in conflict situations, anti-state conflict, subnational movements, militancy, and so on. The difficulty of building solidarities when the entire discourse is so deeply mired in questions of identity, and each identity is more restrictive and more specific, and how do you deal with identity both as a mobilizational tool and as something that traps you into certain kinds of inaction? I think one of the things that comes out is while Roshni questions whether there is actually a cohesive movement, a feminist movement at all in the Northeast, and we might extend that question further to all of India. Is there actually something that we can speak of as a women's movement? But what is unmistakable, I think, in all the presentations today and yesterday, even though I wasn't there, but I heard about them, is that something's happening, and something is happening with women which is really exciting and really interesting. There are certain kinds of solidarities being built, certain kinds of political moves being taken, certain kind of attempts being made to build a critical mass of women in politics, certain kinds of connections being made with the international. And I think that these are really important. And also certain kinds of literatures growing out of this situation, which are carrying those voices much further, and that's something really important for us to note. And as Roshni said, for us to seize that transformative moment that this is pointing to, so that we don't lose out, and something more positive can be gained from this. And it's also another thing that I think comes out is that there is the difficulty of building solidarities across the region that is so torn apart by conflict, and yet the truth that if anyone is doing it, it is women's groups. I think we can say this with conviction and clarity, that whether in the Northeast or elsewhere, but particularly in the Northeast, if solidarities are attempting to be built across the states, if anyone's doing it, it is women's groups, and I think that's something that we really need to note. Those are some of the points that come out for me from all the presentations that have been made this morning. We're open now for questions, some comments, discussions. I know that Margaret wanted to say something. Where are you? Are you here? Do you want to add to any of the points that have been raised?
When it comes to real issues, I can tell you that not much is happening in a way that is making real impact. One of the examples I would like to say is last June 2013, after 40 odd years, that is during the MNF rebellion in 1966, 67 and so on, no doubt a lot of rapes and atrocities were committed from both sides. Honestly, it's not only from the army but even from the underground. And many girls, young girls and maybe wives also have been raped and so on and so forth. Two of them, this is the case that I'm referring to, went mad. Till today, they have not recovered. But ironically, it was the ex-MNA, that is the ex-Mizo army, that fought their case to an extent where eventually they got the center to pay what we would call maybe compensation of 5 lakhs each to those two ladies. There are, I feel that these things should have been taken up by the women groups, which was not done at all. That is the point I'm just trying to make. It took, it took the men group to do it.
I actually ended up running elections in Nagaland last year, the assembly elections there, and I met Rosemary. Supposed to be here, but couldn't make it, it seems. And one of the points that she raised was, difficulties that women have in entering politics. Is that given that in Nagaland women don't have property rights, and elections they are mostly about money, and the requirement of a large amount of financial resources, and when they want to be picked as candidates, they also have to commit to the parties offering them tickets that they will bring this much, they will be able to raise this much amount of money because that would be required in the campaign. I was just wondering what the experience is in other states in the Northeast, with regard to availability of resources and the control that women have on those resources so that they can enter political life.
Get into the electoral process. Many times, my own family members, my children, my husband, my friends, they say, Jackie, you don't have money. I said, yes, I don't have money. But that doesn't stop me from aspiring to, get into the electoral arena. My point is, I may lose the election, but I'll stand up for the values of democracy that I want to see in the voters, or as a leader that I would like to project in my kind of leadership as a woman in politics.
Unless somebody has an absolutely pressing question, maybe it's time that we close the discussion. We've had a really, I think, very interesting, very cross-cutting, very rich and intense panel. And there's a lot of things to learn from it. And I think in some ways everybody is kind of, sunk into a kind of silence, absorbing everything. So I just want to thank all of you and all the speakers, but I want to say one thing before we close in response to what Bilinder defined as being located inside a margin as a woman writer. And I wanted to say, no, 50% is not a margin. So don't worry about that. We are actually the majority from the north. And for somebody whom the margin, the periphery, etc. is empowering, yes, don't see that as sitting, so it's all about the power of women rather than powerlessness. Thank you all very much.